All right, welcome to another deep dive, everybody. So today we're going to look back at the movies of the 1970s, but not in a typical sort of chronological way.
Right.
We're going to look at this through the lens of, well, a book.
Mm-hmm.
A book which is basically a collection of kind of personal memories,
Yeah.
anecdotes from one person's journey through that decade.
Right. Not a history, but a very specific perspective.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So if you're expecting a kind of dry run through of all the big movies, this is definitely not going to be that.
Nope. But I think it makes it so much more interesting.
For sure.
It really captures the sense of discovery,
Yeah.
like what it was really like to be a moviegoer at the time.
And what's really great about this book is it covers such a wide range.
Oh, absolutely.
Of movies. It's not just like the big, the big hits.
Right.
Or the critically acclaimed, kind of prestige pictures.
Mm-hmm.
It gets into the really interesting world, I think, of exploitation cinema.
Yes.
Which, is a whole genre unto itself.
A whole world.
A whole world, and this book kind of dives into all of that.
Yeah, so we get to see, not just the big picture, but kind of the underbelly of the decade in a way.
Exactly. And it all starts with this transition the author talks about from what they call old Hollywood, which I think we all kind of have an image of, right?
Yeah, like the big studio system.
Yeah.
The classic
The
movies.
studio system, the golden age, and they talk about how, things started to shift in the 70s
Mm-hmm.
with, counterculture influences, and then, later into the big blockbuster era.
Exactly. It's kind of bookended by those two.
Yeah.
Those two big movements.
And they set the scene really well by focusing on a particular location.
Yeah, the Sunset Strip. It's such an iconic place.
Yeah, the Sunset Strip and a specific theater on the Strip.
Right, the Tiffany.
The Tiffany Theater. So, yeah, let's jump in there, because that's a fascinating place to start, I think.
It is. And what's interesting about the Tiffany is, well, that's where it was.
Okay.
On the Sunset Strip, but specifically west of La Brea.
Okay.
Because that kind of separated it from what the author calls Hollywood proper.
I see.
Which is east of La Brea. East of La Brea, you had all that nostalgia for old Hollywood. All those murals and movie posters.
Right.
But when you crossed La Brea onto the Strip, well, all that old Hollywood kind of vanished.
Yeah.
It was all, hippie nightclubs.
Yeah.
And head shops and a different kind of cinema altogether.
A different kind of cinema. And speaking of which, they talk a lot about the Tiffany and the kind of movie that we're showing there.
Yeah, they call them head flicks, those counterculture movies.
The counterculture films?
Yeah.
Right. And they mentioned some pretty wild stuff, like Frank Zappa's 200 Motels, Son of Dracula. I mean, can you imagine?
Oh, and of course, Rocky Horror Picture Show. That really blew up at the Tiffany.
Rocky Horror, I mean, that's legendary, right? That's where it really kind of took off.
Exactly. That kind of interactive, participatory movie experience.
Yeah.
That was huge at the Tiffany.
It's fascinating to think about, like how those screenings must have been, like so different from today's kind of, sterile multiplex experience.
Oh, totally. It was an event. It wasn't just about watching a movie. It was about being part of something.
Right. Now, moving on, the author kind of jumps around a bit, which is part of the charm of this book, I think.
Yeah, it's like they're like following their train of thought as they remember these movies.
Exactly. So they talk about this film from 1970, Joe.
Yeah.
Which, I was not really familiar with.
Yeah, it's kind of faded from memory a bit.
It has, but it's actually quite an important film.
It is. I mean, it was a big hit when it came out, and some people even say it influenced Taxi Driver.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But it's a very dark movie, very intense.
Yeah, give us the premise here.
Okay, so it's about this upper middle class father, right?
Okay.
And his daughter gets involved with the hippie drug scene.
Okay.
And things get really messy, and he ends up accidentally killing her boyfriend.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then he meets this guy, this incredibly racist and just outspoken blue-collar guy named Joe.
Okay.
Played by Peter Boyle, who's amazing in it.
Okay.
And the film it's really dark, but it's also surprisingly funny.
Funny.
Yeah, I know it sounds weird.
With that plot.
But the author talks about how even as a kid they were laughing.
Wow.
It's mostly Peter Boyle's performance as Joe.
Okay.
And the dialogue by Norman Wexler, who was known for writing really edgy stuff.
Okay, and what kind of stuff was Joe saying that was making people laugh?
Oh, just these outrageous rants about hippies and black people and just
Right.
society in general. Like, he was just so politically incorrect and so over the top that people couldn't help but laugh.
Oh, wow. So it's kind of like like that uncomfortable laughter where you feel a little bad for laughing.
Exactly. Exactly. But you do laugh because it's just so outrageous.
The author even mentions a specific line about the jukebox in the movie.
Oh, yeah, where he yells, "Christ, they even fucked up the goddamn music."
And people were just dying laughing.
Apparently.
And the author describes it as a cocktail mixed with piss that's disturbingly tasty.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's like, it's bad for you, but you can't help but enjoy it.
Right. Now, but of course, the movie doesn't stay funny
No, definitely not.
because it takes this really dark turn.
It does. Joe and the father, they kind of team up and go on this hippie hunting spree.
Oh, wow.
And it ends tragically with the father accidentally killing his own daughter.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, it's really intense.
That's heavy.
It is.
So it's really interesting to think about, how this film, which is dealing with such serious themes, was also like making people laugh.
Yeah, it's really interesting reflection of the time. It shows how people were dealing with all the social upheaval, the anxieties through humor, even if it was dark humor.
Right, right.
And it also shows how, sometimes humor can be a way to process really disturbing things.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, so moving on. The author then gets into some really personal stories about their own experiences going to the movies as a kid.
Yeah, and specifically about being taken to adult movies.
Adult movies
Yeah.
as a child.
As a child.
Wow.
Which, it was a different time, and it wasn't that uncommon back then.
I guess so, yeah.
But the author talks about these unspoken rules.
Okay.
About how you had to behave during adult time.
Adult time, okay.
Be quiet.
Right?
Observe.
Okay.
No asking dumb questions.
No dumb questions,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So they were very aware that they were kind of like in this adult world.
Exactly. They knew they were there, but not really a part of it. They were just supposed to watch and learn, I guess.
Yeah. And the author actually shares this really funny story about going to see Carnal Knowledge.
Carnal knowledge.
And asking your mom a question during a very suggestive scene.
Oh, yeah, the author was very young at the time.
Very young.
And they innocently asked, "What do they want to do, Mom?"
Oh, my God.
And apparently the whole theater just erupted in laughter.
I bet.
Yeah, it's kind of a cute story, but it also shows you how, kids see things so differently.
Absolutely,
They
absolutely.
don't have those filters yet.
Right, right. So the discussion then turns to this idea of depictions of outsiders in film.
Yeah, how different groups were portrayed.
Right, and how attitudes were changing maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this really striking example from Dirty Harry.
Dirty Harry, yeah.
Yeah, with the gay character.
Purple Poncho, they called him.
Purple Poncho, right.
Yeah.
And the author talks about how the audience was laughing at him.
Yeah, even though he was, about to be killed.
Right.
And the author's stepfather was laughing too.
Even though he was like in the crosshairs of the sniper rifle.
Exactly. It's really disturbing to think about,
Very disturbing.
how little empathy there was for this character.
Right.
And how much of that was because he was gay.
Yeah, it's a really powerful moment in the book because it really shows how deeply ingrained homophobia was at the time.
Mm-hmm. He was just like, accepted.
Yeah. But then on the other hand, there's this other story about the author's mother
Okay.
who defended Rock Hudson.
Rock Hudson.
Yeah.
Okay.
After watching Pretty Maids all in a row,
Oh, interesting.
she was like sticking up for him against these guys who were making fun of him.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting. So you have these two contrasting reactions, even within the same family.
Right. It shows how things were changing.
Yeah. Or at least how there was a mix of attitudes.
Yeah, and cinema was kind of like this battleground for those attitudes.
Absolutely. It was a place where people were confronting these issues, whether they realized it or not.
Right. Now, speaking of confrontation, the author talks about how, violent movies were back then.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, really violent.
Yeah. I mean, compared to today's standards, some of those movies were pretty brutal.
Yeah, they mention a whole bunch of images that just like stuck with them.
Okay, like what?
Like James Cantian getting, shot up at the toll booth in The Godfather,
Oh, yeah.
Mo Green's eye in The Godfather.
Oh,
That propeller scene in Catch-22,
oh, God, that's a tough one.
really intense stuff. And the author's mother, she had this interesting perspective on it. She
Okay.
said context matters.
Context matters.
You know, if the violence has a purpose in the story,
Right.
it's different.
It's not just gratuitous.
Yeah.
It's part of something bigger.
Exactly. So they also talk about this double feature they went to, Sweetback's Badass Song,
Sweetback, yeah.
and Robert Altman's Brewster McCloud.
Brewster McCloud.
And the author's parents, they were not fans.
No.
No.
What didn't they like about them?
Well, Sweetback was a very Black Power film.
Right.
And Brewster McCloud, well, they just thought it was weird.
Weird how?
Like, the author's dad called it the cinematic equivalent of a bird shitting on your head.
Wow. Okay, that's harsh.
Yeah, I guess you had to be there.
I guess so.
So then there's this really great story about the author's first time going to a predominantly Black movie theater
Oh, wow.
to see Jim Brown in Black Gun.
Black Gun, okay.
Yeah, and they were with this friend, Reggie.
Reggie.
And they were like the only white people in the theater.
Wow, that must have been quite an experience.
It was.
What was it like?
Well, the author talks about how everyone was so into the movie.
Mm-hmm.
It was like a communal experience.
Oh, yeah. Blaxploitation movies were really huge in the Black community at that time.
Right. And it was just so different from, their usual movie-going experiences.
I bet.
And it's funny because they talk about how, Reggie's favorite actors were like Jim Brown,
Okay.
Max Julien,
Mm-hmm.
Richard Roundtree.
Yeah.
All these tough guys.
Tough guys, yeah.
And the author's favorite actor at the time was Robert Preston.
Robert Preston from The Music Man.
Yeah.
Wow, that's quite a contrast.
A bit of a contrast. So this experience really kind of opened their eyes to a whole new world of cinema.
It sounds like it.
Yeah.
And it shows how important representation is,
Yeah.
Seeing people who look like you on screen, it
Yeah.
can be really powerful.
Absolutely. And speaking of different worlds, there's this brief but really interesting part where they talk about the Pussycat Theater.
The Pussycat Theater, okay.
Yeah, which was an adult movie theater.
Right.
And the author actually worked there as an usher when they were a teenager.
Well, that's a unique job.
It was. So we get this little glimpse into the adult film scene of the time, which was very different from what it is today.
I bet.
Before home video, it was a whole different world.
Yeah, it was a much more underground scene back then.
Right. So the author then talks about Steve McQueen.
Steve McQueen, okay.
Yeah.
The King of Cool.
The King of Cool, right. And they mention how he was really reluctant to play a cop.
A cop? Why not?
Well, because of his image, He was very aware of his fan base,
Right.
which was largely, young people, a lot of them, kind of anti-established.
The counterculture crowd.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he knew that they didn't really like the police.
Pigs, as they were called back then.
Yeah. So he didn't want to do anything that would, alienate his fans.
That makes sense. I mean, his image was everything.
It was. And they talk about how careful he was about everything.
Cut.
Like how his jeans were cut.
Whoa.
Yeah. How he moved, how he spoke. He was very aware of how he was being perceived.
It's interesting because it shows how much control he had over his persona.
Exactly. It wasn't just about the acting. It was about the whole package.
The whole package.
Yeah. So this leads into a discussion about cop movies.
Cop movies, okay.
Yeah, but specifically like late 60s cop movies.
Okay.
And how formulaic they were.
Formulaic.
Yeah, like the author talks about how, you had all these, big stars playing cops.
Like who?
Frank Sinatra,
Okay.
Sidney Poitier,
Mm-hmm.
Richard Widmark,
Yeah.
George Peppard.
Okay.
But the movies themselves were all kind of the same.
How so?
Well, the cops were all kind of interchangeable.
Right.
They had the same kind of cases,
Mm-hmm.
the same kind of dialogue.
Right.
They all had, like, dissatisfied wives at home.
Oh, the classic trope.
Yeah. And the author makes this interesting point that, like, no one really cared who did it
Really?
because it was all so predictable.
So it wasn't about the mystery. It was more about the star power.
Yeah. And then along comes Bullet.
Bullet.
Yeah, 1968.
Mm-hmm.
And this movie, it kind of breaks the mold.
How so?
Well, instead of focusing on a really complicated plot, it's all about the action.
The action, okay.
Yeah, and the atmosphere.
The atmosphere.
San Francisco.
Okay.
The music, Lalo Schifrin's score.
Oh, yeah. Iconic.
And, of course, Steve McQueen.
Steve McQueen, right. Being cool.
Being cool.
So they talk about this great opening credits sequence and this amazing dinner scene that's almost entirely silent
Oh, wow.
at Coffee Cantata.
Coffee Cantata.
And it's just so beautifully shot.
So it's about the visuals, the mood,
Yeah.
more than the plot points.
Exactly. And the director, Peter Yates, he's quoted as saying that he was more interested in, shooting a movie than, sticking to a schedule.
Interesting.
And it shows, I think, it has that kind of, free-flowing energy to it.
Yeah, and the author, they love this film.
Mm-hmm.
And they even quote this critic, Elvis Mitchell.
Elvis Mitchell, okay.
Who said that if Yates had made just one more film as good as Bullitt, he'd be considered like one of the greats.
Wow, that's high praise.
Yeah. And they talk about McQueen's performance, how it was, a McQueen creation. Totally.
Yeah, that minimalist, cool persona.
Yeah. And it's funny because McQueen, in real life, he was apparently kind of a hothead.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So it's even more impressive that he could, pull off that cool demeanor on screen.
Yeah, it shows how good an actor he was.
And the film itself is just pure cinema, know?
It's cinematic.
It's all about the visuals and the mood and McQueen's presence.
It's an experience, not just a story.
Exactly. Okay, so we go from the cool, the kind of quiet cool of Bullitt to the brutal action of Dirty Harry.
Dirty Harry, yeah.
1971, Don Siegel.
Don Siegel, right?
And the author talks about Siegel's background, how he worked in the montage department at Warner Bros.
Montage department, okay.
Yeah, so he was like, a master of editing.
Right.
And you can see that in his films, how he cuts action scenes. They're so sharp.
Yeah.
So precise.
And the violence it's very different from, say, Peckinpah.
Yeah, they make that comparison.
How so?
Well, Peckinpah, it's more like, bloody, operatic.
Right.
Siegel, it's more like, sudden, shocking.
Brutal.
Yeah, they mentioned that great shot in Dirty Harry.
Which one?
Where Scorpio shoots that guy and it's like a wet red blood hit.
Oh, yeah.
It's so quick and impactful.
Yeah. Siegel knew how to make violence really hit you.
He did. And Dirty Harry, it also has this really interesting viewpoint.
Okay.
Which was, kind of controversial at the time.
How so?
Well, it's basically saying that society is siding with criminals. Okay. And the cops are frustrated.
Right.
And Harry Callahan, he's kind of like the embodiment of that frustration. And they have him up against this really evil character, Scorpio.
Scorpio, who's based on the Zodiac Killer.
Right.
Yeah.
And they talk about the black bank robbers in the film and how they're dressed like, in Black Panther gear.
Oh, wow.
And how that was playing into like the fears of a lot of white people at the time.
Right. The fear of black militancy.
Yeah. So Dirty Harry, it's got this dubious morality, as the author puts it.
Dubious morality. Okay.
Yeah. And they talk about his tendency to create these, what they call Sigelini heroes.
Sigelini heroes. Okay.
Yeah, which are like, these flawed protagonists.
Right.
Who are kind of like, on the edge of the law.
Did you still root for them?
Yeah, you still root for them, even though they're doing these questionable things.
Right.
And they mention, other Siegel films.
Like that?
Matic.
Okay. Coogan's Bluff, The Beguiled.
Yeah, all with these kind of anti-heroes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, Dirty Harry, it got labeled as fascist by some critics.
Fascist?
Yeah, Pauline Kael.
Okay.
Roger Ebert. And the author points out that Siegel himself, he wasn't really a political guy.
No?
No, he was just a filmmaker.
Okay.
And they say that he probably would have just, pointed to the box office.
Right, like the people loved it.
The people loved it. And it's interesting because you can see like both sides of it. On the one hand, you have Harry Callahan, who's, he's fighting crime.
Right.
But he's doing it in this really brutal way.
Right, he's not exactly playing by the rules.
And then you have this whole thing about, torturing Scorpio.
Right.
Which is, really problematic.
Yeah.
And they have this character in the movie who's supposed to be like the voice of the liberal viewpoint.
Yeah. And he's played by Joseph Summer.
Joseph Summer, okay.
And the author describes his arguments as dumbfoundingly absurd.
Wow. Okay, so they're not really taking the liberal side seriously.
No, not really.
Interesting.
But it's still a fascinating film to think about, you know?
It is. It's a real product of its time, but it still resonates today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so we go from Siegel's kind of brutal realism to Peckinpah,
Peckinpah,
The
okay.
Wild Bunch.
The Wild Bunch, yeah.
1969, but the author saw it in 73.
Okay.
And they were just blown away by it.
Yeah, it's a powerful film.
They talk about that slow motion throat slitting scene
Oh, yeah?
and how it was just like so shocking
Mm-hmm.
and how Peckinpah's violence, it's different.
Different from Siegel.
Right.
How so?
Well, it's more like they call it liquid ballet
Liquid ballet, okay.
and visual poetry painted in crimson.
Wow, that's quite a description.
Yeah, it's beautiful, but it's also terrifying.
Right.
And the author talks about how the shock of the film was not just what you saw, but like the audience's reaction to it.
Oh, interesting. Like a collective gasp.
Yeah, like a shared experience of shock and awe.
Yeah, Peckinpah really knew how to push buttons.
He did. Okay, so next up is Burt Reynolds in Deliverance.
Deliverance, okay.
Yeah.
Another classic.
Another classic. And they talk about how the film, it starts off kind of like, fun.
Fun. Delivery.
Yeah, like a rollicking gas, they say.
Okay.
And how the audience is really enjoying Reynolds,
Yeah.
being talk show Bert.
Okay.
And there's even this kind of like homoerotic subtext.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, between Ed and Lewis.
Okay.
And they compare it to like the courtship in the Tall Tea.
Oh, okay.
But then of course you have that really dark scene.
The rape scene.
The rape scene, yeah.
Yeah.
And the author describes it as like a primal ritual. And Reynolds, he kind of becomes the hero in that moment when
Right.
he shoots the mountain man with the bow and arrow.
Right.
But the film really changes after that point.
It does. It becomes much darker.
Yeah, and the author, they argue that the film is actually better than the book.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because it's so vivid.
Okay.
And the actors, they really bring the characters to life.
Mm-hmm.
Especially the two mountain men.
Yeah, played by Bill McKinney and Herbert Cowan.
Right. And